let me be absolutely clear about one thing before I start. None of this was my idea. Well, technically, it was my idea, but emotionally, spiritually, it was all Joseph Long's fault. Everything that happened, the fake dating scheme, the catastrophic fallout, the firing, all of it, traces back to the moment Joseph Long walked into the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of Halcyon Media Group and looked right through me like I was a decorative plant. I had been working at Halcyon for 3 years at that point, 3 years of 12-hour days, cold coffee, and learning to survive in an open-plan office where the air conditioning ran at a temperature usually reserved for preserving cadavers. I was good at my job. Great even. I was the senior copywriter on the brand voice team, which meant I was the person who decided how a company sounded to the world. I gave companies their personality, their warmth, their edge. I was, by every measurable standard, excellent at manufacturing feelings, which made it particularly humiliating that I had absolutely no control over my own. Joseph Long joined Halcyon as the new creative director in March. I found out about his hiring through the company Slack, a casual announcement buried between a reminder about the broken microwave on floor 12 and someone's lost umbrella. Please welcome Joseph Long, our new creative director. Joseph comes to us from Meridian & Cole in New York, where he led award-winning campaigns for Fortune 500 clients. We're thrilled to have him. I read it twice. Then I Googled him. That was my first mistake. His professional headshot was the kind of photograph that made you feel vaguely accused of something. Dark eyes that seemed to be evaluating a problem you hadn't presented yet. A jaw that looked like it had been drawn by someone who wanted to prove a point. He wasn't smiling in the photo, but there was something at the corner of his mouth. Not quite amusement. Not quite contempt. Something in the space between that made him look like he was already several steps ahead of whatever room he was in. I closed the tab. I opened it again. I closed it. I told myself it was just professional curiosity. I was going to be working under this man. It was entirely reasonable to want to know what I was dealing with. Then I spent the rest of the afternoon building an elaborate mental profile of Joseph Long based on nothing but a headshot and the LinkedIn page, and I knew I was in trouble. He started on a Monday. My team had a brief introduction meeting that afternoon in the glass conference room. The kind of meeting that exists solely to produce discomfort. 8 of us sat around the table, me, my colleague Dara Osei, the 3 junior writers, our project manager Nkichi, and 2 people from the art department whose names I always mixed up. Joseph walked in at exactly 2 o'clock, not 1:58, not 2:03. 2 o'clock precisely, which was its own kind of statement. Up close, he was exactly what the headshot had promised, and somehow still a surprise. Tall, a few inches taller than me, and I'm not short. Dark hair, slightly longer on top, pushed back in a way that suggested carelessness, but had probably been considered. The suit was charcoal gray, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. He moved through the room with a particular ease of someone who had been the most capable person in every room he'd ever entered and had simply stopped being surprised by it. He introduced himself briefly, told us he was looking forward to learning how the team operated, said he believed in collaboration, direct communication, and high standards. Not aggressive, not performative, just matter of fact, like he was reciting facts about geography. Then he went around the table, asked each of us to say what we were working on, and what we thought was working well, and what we'd change if we could. When he got to me, I gave what I believed was a clean, intelligent answer about the current brand voice inconsistencies I've been trying to flag for 6 months. I spoke about the lack of tonal guidelines, the way different writers were pulling in different directions, the need for a comprehensive style document that could anchor everything. Joseph looked at me steadily while I talked. When I finished, he was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. That's the first useful thing anyone said in this meeting, he said. Write it up. I want a proposal on the style guide by the end of the week. And then he moved on to Dara. That was it. That was the whole interaction. No smile, no warmth, no further acknowledgement. Just, useful, do this thing. Next. I should have felt dismissed. I should have felt reduced to a function. Instead, I went home that evening and absolutely could not stop thinking about him. The first month was a study in professional torture. Joseph was, by any objective measure, a remarkable creative director. He was decisive without being autocratic. He had the rare ability to look at a piece of work and identify in seconds what was wrong with it, not by attacking the execution, but by asking a single question that made you see the fundamental problem yourself. He pushed the team harder than anyone had in years, but the work that came out of it was genuinely better. Even the people who found him intimidating, and most people did, admitted the quality had improved. I, meanwhile, was in a state of low-grade internal catastrophe. The issue wasn't that I found him attractive. I could handle that. Attraction is manageable. You acknowledge it, you put it in a drawer, you get on with things. The problem was that I also deeply, genuinely respected him as a professional, which meant that every time he challenged one of my ideas, I couldn't just dismiss it as arrogance. Every time he looked at something I'd written and said, "This is close. What are you actually trying to say here?" I had to take it seriously, which meant I was spending approximately 40% of my working day in a state of heightened attention toward a man who, as far as I could tell, regarded me as a reliable office appliance. Dara noticed. Of course Dara noticed. Dara was my closest friend in the office and also a person of uncanny perceptiveness who once diagnosed a mutual friend's failing relationship from a single Instagram caption. "You've got the Joseph face," she said, appearing at my desk on a Thursday afternoon with 2 coffees and no warning. "I don't have a face." "You absolutely have a face. It's the face you make when he's in your eyeline and you're trying very hard to look like you're not looking at him while clearly looking at him." "I'm working." "You have a draft that says bold, innovative, and then nothing." You stopped mid-sentence. She set a coffee in front of me and perched on the edge of my desk. "Matt, honey, don't honey me. He's your boss." "I'm aware. He's very severe." "I'm aware of that too. He once made Liam from Art cry by asking him to explain his color choices. Not even critically, just asked him to explain them and Liam cried. Liam is very sensitive." "Matt." "Dara." She looked at me with an expression of fondness and profound pity. "Okay, I'm just gonna say, be careful, because you have a tendency to fall for people who are going to make your life difficult, and this one seems like he could make it very difficult indeed." She wasn't wrong. She was never wrong. That was the most exhausting thing about her. By the second month, Joseph and I had developed something. I wasn't sure what to call it. It wasn't a friendship. There was too much professional distance for that. It wasn't purely professional, because occasionally there were moments that didn't belong in the category of work. It was something that existed in the margins. We worked late on the same evenings, which was coincidence, the first time in pattern after that. The office had a particular quality after 7 o'clock. The air conditioning finally relented, the ambient noise of 30 conversations died away, and the open plan floor became something quieter and more honest. We would end up at the coffee station at the same time or in the kitchen, and we would talk. He asked about the style guide project, which I'd submitted and he'd approved with minimal changes. He had thoughts about the company's positioning in the market. He had opinions, strong, considered ones, about what good writing actually did versus what it performed. Those conversations were the most intellectually alive I'd felt in years. Occasionally, the conversations moved off the professional track. He'd grown up in several different cities, his father had been in international finance, and the family moved every few years. It had given him, he said once, a useful detachment from place. He didn't mean it as something sad. It was just a fact. The way he stated facts about himself, without self-pity, without performance, was something I found quietly extraordinary. Once, very late on a Friday, after everyone else had gone and we'd both been in for 11 hours, I said something that made him laugh. A real laugh. Not the controlled, brief acknowledgement I'd seen him deploy in meetings, but something spontaneous and genuine that rearranged his whole face. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then he composed himself and looked slightly annoyed, like his face had done something without authorization. I thought about that laugh for days. Hysteon hired a new account manager named Caden Park. Caden was 26 to my 31, with the kind of easy confidence that came from being conventionally attractive and knowing it without being insufferable about it. He was good at his job, quick, sociable, the kind of person who remembered everyone's coffee orders within a week. He and I ended up working on the same client account, a rebrand for a logistics company that was trying very hard to seem human, and we got along well. He asked me to get a drink after work about 3 weeks in. I said yes, thinking it was a work thing. It became clear fairly quickly that it wasn't a work thing. I liked Caden. He was warm and funny and uncomplicated in a way that felt like standing in sunlight after months in a cold office. But the evening had this peculiar quality, which was that I kept thinking about Joseph, not in the obsessive way, just a steady undercurrent, a kind of comparison I couldn't stop making. Caden said something clever, and I thought, Joseph would have gone further with that. Caden made me laugh, and the laugh felt light, pleasant, surface level. Different from the 3 seconds of seeing Joseph's face rearranged. I went home and sat with myself for a while and tried to be honest about what was happening. The honest answer was, I was starting to feel things about Joseph Long that had moved well past professional admiration, and there was nothing I could do about it, because he was my creative director and he showed no indication of seeing me as anything other than a competent senior copywriter who occasionally produced useful proposals. The other honest answer was, I was 29% tempted to go out with Caden again. Not because I was particularly interested in Caden, but because there was a smaller, pettier, more embarrassing part of me that wanted to see what Yosef would do. I told myself that was a terrible idea and went to bed. I want to be very clear that I did not immediately pursue the terrible idea. I held it at arm's length for 2 full weeks. I had conversations with myself about dignity and professionalism and the importance of not using a real human being as a prop in my own emotional theater. Then Joseph Long sat down across from me in a client feedback meeting and said about the campaign headline I'd spent 3 days writing that it was almost there, and something about the way he said it, that particular tone, that particular look, like he could see exactly where my thinking had stopped short and wanted me to see it too, made me want to crawl out of my own skin with some combination of humiliation and something I refused to name. I went to drinks with Caden that Friday. Here's what I told myself. It was just drinks. Caden knew I wasn't looking for anything serious. We were friends who occasionally had drinks. There was nothing manipulative about having a social life. Here is what I was actually doing. Arriving to those drinks having thought very carefully about what I was wearing, knowing that Yosef also sometimes went to the bar 2 blocks from the office on Friday evenings, and not hoping he'd be there. He was there. I spotted him at the bar with 2 people from the strategy team, a drink in front of him, looking at his phone with the focused expression of someone who found even their leisure time something to be managed efficiently. I'd chosen a table far enough away to seem coincidental, close enough to be in his peripheral vision. Caden was excellent company. We talked and laughed, and at some point he put his hand over mine on the table in a way that was a question, and I didn't pull away, and that was a kind of answer. I looked up once and found Yosef's eyes across the room. They moved away immediately. Clean, controlled, indifferent. The reasonable interpretation was, he'd noticed 2 colleagues and looked away because there was nothing to see. The interpretation I was operating on at 11 o'clock that Friday, slightly warm from 2 drinks and more than slightly desperate, he'd looked away too quickly. The indifference had been calibrated. There had been a fraction of a second before the look away where his expression had done something. I was probably inventing this. I was aware I was probably inventing this, but I went home that night with something that felt like momentum. Over the following 2 weeks, Caden and I went out 3 more times. Each time the emotional accounting in my head was 30% genuinely enjoying Caden's company, which felt real and something I was glad of, 70% in a state of constant low-level awareness of what Yosef might or might not know about my social life. It is not a period of my life I look back on with tremendous pride. The problem, one of several problems, was that I hadn't been honest with Caden. He thought something real was developing. He was attentive and kind and making plans, and I was, in my worst moments, nodding along while using him as a human chess piece in a strategy against a man who didn't even know he was playing. Dara found out, of course. You're doing the thing, she said. What thing? The thing where you use a nice person to make an unavailable person pay attention. That's a very uncharitable framing. Is it inaccurate? I didn't answer. Matt. She leaned forward. Caden is a good person, and you're not a bad person, which means if you keep doing this, you're going to make both of you feel terrible. I like Caden. Liking someone isn't the same as being fair to them. Maybe I'm trying to move on. Maybe seeing Caden is how I get over whatever this is with Joseph. Dara looked at me for a long moment with an expression I can only describe as sorrowful patience. Matt, you have never once in your life successfully manufactured feelings for someone as a strategy to stop having feelings for someone else. You are not built that way. She was right. She was so comprehensively right, and I knew she was right at the time. I kept seeing Caden. In between those drinks with Caden, something else was happening at work that I was trying very hard to treat as purely professional. Josef had started including me in a small working group he'd assembled for what the company was internally calling the Horizon Initiative, a long-term repositioning of Halcyon's own brand identity. Not client work, internal work. The kind of project that a creative director uses to establish vision, to set a tone for what the whole company believes about itself. There were 6 people in the working group. Me, Dara, 2 people from strategy, 1 from design, 1 from the brand team. We met on Wednesday mornings in the small conference room. Not the glass-walled one on 14, but a warmer one on 12, with actual walls and a window that faced east. Joseph ran the sessions differently than he ran everything else. Less directive, more exploratory. He asked questions and let them sit in the room for a long time before he offered anything himself. Once he asked the group, "What is the most honest thing we can say about what this company does?" The room went quiet the way rooms do when people are genuinely thinking versus the quiet of people waiting for someone else to speak first. I said, "We tell people who they are when they don't know how to say it themselves." Joseph looked at me for 3 seconds. Then he wrote it on the whiteboard without commenting and moved on. Afterward, when the session broke up and people filtered out, he held back. Not overtly, just a fractional delay. The kind that could be accidental. "That line," he said, "it might be too conceptual for actual copy." "No. It's the brief. That's what we're doing. Write it as a brief." He picked up his notebook. 1 page. For next week, I wrote the brief. It became the foundation of the entire Horizon repositioning, which Halcyon later used to win a major industry award. Joseph credited it in the award submission as collaborative work by the Horizon Group. He also, on the day the submission was filed, sent me a message on Slack that said, "Good instinct." The first version usually is, "I read it 6 times. Then I closed the app and went to get water and told myself to stop." Here is when things shifted. It was a Thursday. The team had a project review, one of the quarterly ones where we walked through everything in the pipeline and Joseph gave feedback. It was long and grueling, and by the end of it I had 5 pages of notes and a profound need for coffee. I was in the kitchen filling my mug when I heard Joseph come in behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew his footsteps, which was its own confession. "The Parks campaign," he said. I kept my back to him. "Professional, normal. The tagline you pitched in there, the distance between here and everywhere. That's good." I turned around. He was standing by the counter, arms crossed, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, which was not unusual. I could never read him. That was the entire problem. "Thank you. It's the kind of line that only works because it's true. That's hard to do. Most people write around the truth." He paused. "You don't do that, even when you're in your own way, which is often the underlying instinct is sound." I stared at him. He had never said anything like this. Specific feedback, yes. Direct challenges, yes. But this was something else. This was a kind of recognition I hadn't been prepared for. "I appreciate that," I said, and my voice was very careful. Something crossed his face. Quick. Gone. "You're seeing someone," he said. Not a question. Not really a statement. More like something said aloud that had been thought. The kitchen was very quiet. "Caden Park," I said. "From accounts. I know who he is." A pause. "Is it serious?" My heart was doing something uncomfortable. I reminded myself to breathe. "We've been out a few times." He nodded once, the small decisive nod he used when a piece of information had been filed. "Right." He straightened, picked up his coffee. "Good work on the tagline." And he left. I stood in the kitchen for approximately 90 seconds, staring at the counter, doing nothing. Then I got my phone out and texted Dara. Something just happened. The thing about being in a precarious emotional situation is that hope is genuinely dangerous. Because once you have evidence, or what you decide is evidence, your brain stops operating on reason and starts operating on narrative. And narrative brains are catastrophically bad at risk assessment. I had decided that, "Is it serious?" was evidence. I had decided that the 3-second pause before he asked and the particular quality of his expression when I answered was evidence. I had decided that something had shifted, that there was a vector, a possibility, a direction. What I should have done, nothing. Kept seeing Caden honestly or stop seeing him honestly. Stay professional. Let the thing with Joseph exist as an unrequited feeling that would eventually metabolize into something manageable. What I actually did, I let Caden hold my hand at the company's summer drinks event 3 weeks later, where Joseph would be present, and I let myself exist in his eyeline for the entire evening. The summer event was on the rooftop of the building. Fairy lights, a bar, the kind of warm evening that made the city look generous. Most of the company was there. It was the sort of event where the professional and personal blurred at the edges, where conversations ran long and people said things they'd normally keep contained. Caden was attentive and good-looking and in a good mood. I was trying to be present with him and failing at it in ways I wasn't proud of. At some point in the evening, I became aware of Joseph standing about 15 feet away, in conversation with someone from the executive team. He was not looking at me. He was entirely engaged with his conversation, the focused, direct engagement he brought to everything. At some point, Caden leaned in and said something, and I turned to him, and we were close, and I think from 15 feet away it probably looked like something. I glanced over. Joseph was looking at his drink. Then, very deliberately, he looked up and directly at me. It lasted 1 second. Then he returned to his conversation. I turned back to Caden and tried to be a person. What happened next, I found out from Dara and then later partially from Joseph himself. The following Monday, Joseph had a meeting with HR about the company's internal relationship policy. Specifically, the clause about professional conduct and conflicts of interest in interdepartmental relationships. Halcyon had a policy that required disclosure when two employees in a reporting relationship started dating, and while Joseph didn't directly manage Caden, they were in adjacent departments and he oversaw the account that Caden and I shared. This was, on the surface, a procedural thing. Companies do this. It's sensible. Except that the outcome of this procedural thing was that Caden was transferred from our joint account and reassigned to a different team. It was presented to Caden as a routine restructuring. The account team was being reorganized. It happened all the time. He had no reason to think otherwise. I found out 2 days later when Caden mentioned it, confused but not particularly alarmed. I stood very still in the middle of our conversation and tried to arrange my face into an appropriate expression. When did this happen? I asked. Last week sometime. Got the email Friday. They said it was just a capacity thing. He shrugged. Bit annoying. I liked working on the Parks account, but it's fine. It was fine. He was fine. He was fine. But I was standing there understanding, with a clarity that felt like cold water, exactly what had happened. Joseph had moved Cotton off our shared account. I spent the afternoon trying to build an interpretation in which this was purely procedural. The policy existed. It was reasonable. Maybe someone in HR had flagged it without Joseph's specific involvement. Maybe it was coincidence. By 4 o'clock, I had abandoned all pretense of neutrality. I knocked on the door of Joseph's office. He had a real one, glass-walled, corner-facing, the kind that said this person makes decisions. And when he looked up from his screen and said, "Come in," I did. I closed the door behind me. The office had this quality in the late afternoon. The sun came through the west-facing windows at a low angle and turned everything amber, and I remember thinking the timing was inconvenient because even now, even in this moment, Joseph Long and amber afternoon light was a problem for me. Caden Park was moved off the Parks account, I said. Joseph set down his pen. His expression was level. There was a conflict of interest review. There was no conflict of interest. We weren't in a direct reporting relationship. He reported to account management, which reports to creative. It's proximate enough to flag under the policy. He said this with a calm that was infuriating. That policy gets applied with discretion. No one else in a similar situation has been restructured. I applied it with discretion. I determined that in this case, you moved him. A pause. The late sun moved slightly. Joseph looked at me with an expression I had spent 3 months trying to decode, and for the first time, something in it was legible. Not much. Not clearly. But something. The policy exists for reasons, he said. His voice was careful in a way it hadn't been a moment ago. Joseph, I heard myself say his name in a way I'd never said it in this office. Direct, unmediated, not professional. Did you move Cotton Park because of the policy, or did you move him because of I stalked? Because of what exactly? Because of what exactly? Because of something I might have read into a look across a rooftop? That sentence had no safe ending. The room was very quiet. Joseph stood up from his chair. He didn't come around the desk. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at me, and his expression was doing the thing, that thing I could never parse, that controlled, contained thing that I had spent months wanting to understand. The policy was followed correctly, he said. HR signed off. That's not what I asked. He looked at me for 3 long seconds. Then, is there something else you wanted to discuss? Dismissal. Clean, controlled, definitive. I left. I called Dara that evening and told her everything in one long, continuous sentence that lasted approximately 4 minutes and contained no punctuation. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. He fired him, she said. He didn't fire him. He reassigned him. He fired him from your life. Dara. Matt. He is a senior executive at a company who used an HR policy as a weapon to remove a man he perceived as a romantic threat. A pause. This is both a massive red flag and, honestly, the most romantic thing I've ever heard. It is absolutely not romantic. It's a little romantic. Is he institutional power too? Yes, and that's the red flag. I said both things. I'm holding both things simultaneously, which is what adults do. She sighed. What are you going to do about Caden? This was the question I'd been avoiding, because the honest answer was, I had never been fair to Caden. I had used him, even gently, even without malice, and the fact that something unexpected had come of it didn't make that better. If anything, it made it more important to be honest now. I need to talk to Caden, I said. Yes, you do. And then I need to figure out what's actually happening with Yosef. Also, yes. Another pause. For what it's worth, and I want to be careful how I say this, I've seen how he looks at you when you're not looking at him. My heart did the thing. I told it to stop. How does he look at me? Like you're a problem he can't stop working on. She sounded fond and slightly sad. Which is, knowing you both, probably exactly true. I had a long, honest conversation with Caden on a Tuesday evening over coffee. Not drinks, coffee, which signaled the seriousness of my intentions. I told him that I'd been going through something complicated, that I hadn't been fair to him, that he was genuinely a wonderful person who deserved someone whose attention wasn't divided. I didn't tell him about Yosef. That wasn't his to carry. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, I sort of knew something was off. I kept thinking maybe you just needed more time. You deserved more than me waiting to figure myself out. Yeah, he said, not unkindly. But I'm glad you said something. He looked at his coffee. Is there someone else? I thought about lying. The lie was right there. It's complicated, I said instead. He nodded. Seemed to accept this. We sat for a while and talked about other things, the park's account, a film we'd both seen, the broken microwave, and when we left, we hugged briefly, and it was the kind of ending that felt clean. Not painless, clean. I walked home alone and thought about what came next. Here is something I knew about Joseph Long. He was direct. He said what he meant in professional contexts, with very little decoration. He asked questions and expected honest answers. He did not, in my experience, respond well to avoidance. The thing I had never done, the thing I had been orbiting for months, was be direct back. I had let things accumulate in the unspoken space between us. I had made moves without making my intentions clear. I had watched and waited and tried to read signals instead of simply saying the thing. I was 31 years old. I wrote words for a living. I was gonna go say some. I went into the office the next morning and sent Joseph a message on Slack asking if we could meet to discuss something outside a formal work context. Could I take 30 minutes of his time? Not as his direct report, but as a colleague outside the office at his convenience. His response took 40 minutes, which was long for him. He usually replied within 5. Sure. 6 p.m., the coffee place on Meridian. You know it? I did know it. The coffee place on Meridian was small and warm and smelled like cardamom. Joseph was there when I arrived. At a table in the back corner. No laptop, no phone on the table. Just him, a coffee, and the particular expression of someone who has prepared themselves for a conversation. I sat down. Ordered. Let a moment pass. I owe you an honest conversation, I said. His eyes were steady, waiting. I wasn't being fully honest with myself for the past few months about what I wanted and what I was doing about it, and that affected how I behaved with Caden and I paused. And around you. No response. Absolutely no readable response. He was made of stone. I pressed on. The thing with Caden. I don't think I was ever genuinely invested in that. Which isn't fair to him. I've talked to him. We're on good terms now. But I want to be honest about why I was in that situation, and I think part of it was that I was trying to. Every word felt like walking on something unstable. I was trying to make you notice me, I said. In a way I wasn't willing to do directly, which was cowardly, and I'm sorry for that. The silence lasted long enough that I started planning an exit strategy. Then Joseph said, What do you want, Matt? His voice was quiet. Not cold. Quiet. I want. The direct answer. Be direct. I want to know if what I think has been happening between us is real. If it's something you've been aware of. If it's something you... I looked at my coffee. If it means something to you, or if I've been constructing something entirely in my own head. A pause. Why did it take you this long? I looked up. His expression had changed. Not dramatically. Nothing about him was ever dramatic. But something had shifted. Something less controlled. Because you're my boss, I said. Because you're the most unreadable person I've ever met. Because every time I thought I saw something, I talked myself out of it. The rooftop event, he said. Yes. You were with him and you kept. He stopped. said something quieter, almost to himself. Then, I moved Caden off your shared account. I know. That was inappropriate use of policy, and I know that. He looked directly at me. But I want to be accurate, it wasn't punitive toward him. I wasn't thinking clearly about the implications for him. I was thinking. Another pause, and this one had a quality I hadn't seen in him before. The quality of a man choosing honesty over composure. I was thinking about you, which is also something I should tell you has been a consistent problem since about 3 weeks after I joined this company. The cardamom smell. The warm light, his voice saying a consistent problem since about 3 weeks after I joined this company. 3 weeks, I said. You came into the onboarding meeting with 6 specific observations about structural issues in the brand voice strategy and a clear framework for addressing them, and you said them directly and without performing them, and I thought, a brief pause, something almost like wryness. I thought this is going to be a problem. Because of the policy. Because I wanted to impress you, he said, with the same tone he'd once used to describe logistics, and I don't. He looked slightly pained. I'm not accustomed to that. I sat with this information, let it settle. Joseph, I said carefully, are you telling me you spent 3 months trying to impress the person who reports to you, while I spent 3 months fabricating a fake situationship to get your attention? Something shifted in his face, the corners of his mouth. 3 seconds this time, maybe 4. That's an accurate summary, he said. I want to be honest about what came next, because I think stories that stop at the moment of mutual confession do a disservice to everyone. What came next was complicated. There was the question of the policy, not Caden's reassignment specifically. That had been handled, and Joseph had, on his own initiative, spoken to HR about restoring Caden to his original position with a proper explanation that had nothing to do with us. Caden got his account back. He was, as far as I could tell, unbothered and already interested in someone else on the 5th floor, but there was still the matter of Joseph being my creative director, of power differentials and professional integrity and all the real, legitimate reasons why this kind of thing was complicated. We talked about it at that table in the Cardamom coffee shop for over an hour. He was, characteristically, direct about every difficult thing. The conflicts it would create, the perceptions it might invite, the fact that he would need to recuse himself from any formal evaluations of my work. He wasn't building reasons to stop. He was building the honest picture of what proceeding would mean. I'm not interested in something that compromises either of our professional reputations, he said. Or that's unfair to the team. Neither am I. So we'd be transparent. I disclosed to HR and to the management layer above me. We establish what appropriate distance looks like in work contexts. He looked at me. Does that feel manageable to you? It was such a Joseph way to approach this methodical, honest, thorough. I found it deeply endearing in a way I probably shouldn't have admitted immediately. Yes, I said. It does. Another pause, quieter this time. I should also say, he added, that I'm sorry about Caden. It wasn't, I handled that badly. Using process as a substitute for honesty. You could have just told me how you felt. I could have just told me how you felt. I could have. He held my gaze. I'm telling you now. You are, I agreed. Finally, the almost smile. The corner of his mouth, the thing I had been cataloging for months. You're going to be very difficult, he said. You handled a whole company's brand voice problems in your first month and you're worried about me? This time the smile was real. Brief, real, slightly disbelieving, like he was still surprised his face could do that. There are things I want to tell you about the months that followed because I think they matter. The disclosure conversation with HR was uncomfortable and handled well. Joseph's manager, a composed, practical woman named Adrian who had overseen the company for 12 years, listened to the situation with the expression of someone who had heard stranger things and said the important things were transparency and professional conduct, both of which she believed, having observed us, we were capable of. The team found out gradually, the way things in offices find out. Not from an announcement, but from the accumulated weight of things people notice. The way I no longer tensed when Joseph came into a room. The way he occasionally directed a question to me with a fraction more directness than was strictly necessary. Dara, who already knew, said nothing but started giving me the expression of vindicated prophecy on a regular basis. Most people were, to my relief, unbothered. Nietzsche from project management said, I had a feeling, with the satisfaction of someone completing a crossword. Liam from art, who had famously cried during a color critique, hugged me in the kitchen and said, you deserve something good. with a sincerity that made me genuinely emotional. The junior writers on the team behaved with studied professional normalcy that told me they'd been briefed by Dara and sworn to decorum. The only genuinely awkward moment was with a senior strategist named Paul who had, without my awareness, apparently harbored his own feelings about Joseph for most of the preceding year. He was not rude about it. He was dignified and quiet and moved his desk to the other side of the floor, which I respected enormously. Working in proximity to someone you're developing real feelings for is different from the spectacular mess of the months before. It's quieter. The awareness doesn't go away. If anything, it intensifies, because now it's grounded in something real rather than projected onto uncertainty, but it settles into something you can carry without it destabilizing you. I watched him in meetings and found the things I'd always found compelling about him. And now I could also know that he went home to an apartment that was spare and ordered and had an inexplicable shelf of paperback thrillers that he was slightly embarrassed about, that he made good coffee and bad breakfast decisions, that the controlled, precise person in the conference room was also the person who at 11 on a Saturday was a little loose and a little warmer and would tell me things with a candor he didn't have access to under fluorescent light. He was exactly as difficult as promised, demanding in ways that were sometimes exhausting. He had high standards for everything, including me, and would not lower them for the sake of comfort, which was occasionally infuriating, and ultimately, I think, one of the things I loved most about him. He pushed me in ways that were genuinely good for my work and my thinking, and the challenge of it, the challenge of him, was something I hadn't known I was hungry for until I had it. There were arguments. Actual, genuine disagreements, mostly about work at first because that was the language we both spoke most fluently. Once about 3 months in, we had a disagreement so protracted and invested that it ran from a Wednesday afternoon meeting all the way through a shared dinner and ended with both of us sitting on his apartment floor at 11 at night with printed drafts spread between us like evidence, arguing about whether a particular campaign positioning was emotionally truthful or just emotionally adjacent. He was wrong, for the record. Or at least, I was right about the specific thing, and he later acknowledged it in his particular way. Not with an apology exactly, but with an adjustment of position that was as honest as any apology. I told him he was infuriating when he refused to admit fault directly. He told me I was infuriating when I needed to hear the words out loud, rather than seeing the action. Those things are different, I said. They are, he agreed. We're different. Is that going to be a problem? He thought about this with the genuine consideration he gave every question. No, he said. I don't think different is a problem. I think it's what makes it work. I looked at him across the scattered printouts on his apartment floor and thought, he is the most direct person I know, and also the most difficult to read, and somehow those are both true simultaneously. And I have no idea what I'm doing, and I think I might be entirely sure of this. He was also, in private, capable of a tenderness that completely undid me. The way he paid attention, he was a person who listened. Really listened, the kind of listening that made you feel your words had been received rather than just heard. Once on a quiet evening, I told him about a piece of work I was genuinely proud of. Nothing important, just something I'd written for myself, not for a client. And he read it carefully. And when he looked up, his expression was the one I couldn't name, the one that had been unreadable for months, and I understood finally what it was. It was the expression of someone who was moved and didn't quite know what to do with that. "This is very good," he said, quietly. Coming from Joseph Long, those 4 words were the equivalent of a standing ovation. There was also this. About 6 weeks after we started seeing each other properly, I came into the office on a Monday after a difficult weekend. Nothing dramatic, just the low-grade accumulation of small things. A conversation with my mother that hadn't gone well, a piece of work I'd convinced myself was wrong. The ordinary weight of a life that occasionally requires maintenance. I wasn't visibly anything. I was fine, professionally. Joseph saw it. He didn't say anything in public. He waited until we were in the small conference room alone under the pretense of reviewing a document, and then he set the document aside and said, "What happened this weekend?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "You seem off." Just, "What happened?" stated with the directness he applied to everything. I told him. The whole messy, unimportant accumulation of it, the things that were too small to justify feeling bad about but that had piled up anyway. He listened, didn't try to solve it, didn't offer reassurance I hadn't asked for, just received it. At the end he said, "That sounds like a lot for 2 days." "It's not a big deal." I didn't say it was a big deal. I said it sounds like a lot. He looked at me. "You don't have to make it small." That was it. That was the whole thing. But I thought about it for days afterward. The particular gift of someone refusing to let you minimize yourself, not by inflating the problem, but by simply saying, you don't have to make it small. I had been making myself small around him for months before the coffee shop. Choosing indirection over honesty, implication over statement, performance over truth. The irony was not lost on me that the person I had the most difficulty being direct with turned out to be, once I finally managed it, the person most equipped to handle my directness. Dara was insufferable about it in the best way. I called it, she said, roughly 6 weeks after the coffee shop conversation. We were eating lunch at our usual spot 2 blocks from the office. I called it from day one. You told me to be careful. Being careful is not the same as being against it. I told you to be careful because you were about to do something chaotic, which you then absolutely did, and it somehow worked out anyway, which I did not predict but am delighted by. You predicted Yosef's feelings before I did. Yes, she looked pleased about this. I'm very good. He fired a man, I pointed out, over me, reassigned. Dara. Over me, reassigned. Dara. He also fixed it, and he disclosed everything to HR and handed over your performance evaluations to an external process. He handled the aftermath professionally and honestly. She tilted her head. The firing was a problem. The handling of the problem was actually quite mature. I thought about this. He's going to be a lot, I said. You are also a lot, she said. You spent 3 months manufacturing a fake relationship to make your boss jealous. You are not a low-drama person, Matt. This was fair, she ate a fry thoughtfully. Can I say one more thing? You're going to say it whether I say yes or not. I've known you for 3 years, she said. I've seen you date people you like but didn't challenge you, and I've seen you date people who challenged you but didn't actually see you. Joseph does both things simultaneously, which is, she paused, unusual. For you. I was quiet for a moment. He told me I don't have to make things small, I said. Dara looked at me for a long time. Yeah, she said softly. That's the one. There is one more scene I want to tell you because it feels like it belongs here even though it happened nearly a year after the coffee shop conversation, which means I'm jumping ahead. Which means this is less of a linear story and more of what it actually was. A collection of moments that I return to and understand differently each time. Halcyon had its annual creative showcase, an internal event where teams presented the year's best work, framed not for clients but for themselves. The kind of occasion that reminded everyone why they'd chosen this industry in the first place. Josef presented the Horizon repositioning, the brief I'd written, the whole evolved campaign that had grown from that single line in the Wednesday morning session. He was extraordinary to watch when he presented. All the precision and clarity that made him formidable in meetings, but with something looser underneath it. A genuine investment not just in the craft, but in the meaning of the work. He talked about what it meant to help companies find their honest voice, what it required to resist the easy version of a brief and hold out for the true one. At one point, he said, the thing that unlocked this whole positioning, the brief that became the foundation, came from someone on this team who had the instinct to say what the company actually did, rather than what it wanted to sound like. That's the hardest skill in this business, and it's not teachable. You either see the truth in the work or you don't. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. Dara, sitting beside me, pressed her shoulder briefly against mine. After the showcase, during the drinks that followed, Joseph found me by the window of the event room. The city was doing its thing outside, illuminated and indifferent and beautiful in the way cities are when you happen to be standing in the right place at the right time. Good event, I said. You're not going to say anything about the presentation? I thought it was excellent. Matt, I thought it was excellent, I repeated, and let the pause hold what I meant by it. He looked at me with the expression that had taken me so long to read and that I now recognized as clearly as my own handwriting. The look of someone who was moved and was increasingly allowing himself to show it. The line was good, he said, but you knew that. I knew it was right. I didn't know it would become. All of that. That's what right things do, he said. They grow. Outside the window, the city hummed. Inside the room, 30 people from Halcyon ate canopies and talked about their year, and I stood beside Joseph Long, my boss, my problem. The most difficult and most worthwhile thing I had stumbled into, and felt the quiet certainty of something that had started in confusion and chaos and a misused HR policy and had become against all reasonable expectation. Exactly what I wanted. That's what right things do. They grow. The last thing I want to tell you is this. About 4 months in, on a Friday evening that had gone late, Joseph and I were the last ones in the office again. The pattern that had existed before the coffee shop, the two of us and the quiet after 7, and the different quality of conversation hadn't gone away. If anything, it had deepened. We were both finally wrapping up. He'd been reading something and I'd been working on a proposal, and the office had that amber evening quality again, and he closed his laptop and looked over at me. "Do you remember the tagline?" he said. I looked up. "Which one?" "The distance between here and everywhere." He said it the way I'd written it, with the weight of it. "I told you that day it only worked because it was true." "You did." "I wasn't wrong about that." He looked at me steadily. "But I didn't tell you what I was actually thinking." I waited. I was thinking, this person writes things that are true. He can't help it. He paused. "It's rare, and I'd spent a month trying not to think about it. I had written words for a living for 9 years. I had written love letters for clients who couldn't find their own. I had shaped the voice of companies, gave them personality and warmth and the texture of feeling. I did not, in that moment, have a single word." Joseph, watching my face, produced the real smile, the fully committed one I'd only seen a handful of times. The one that rearranged his whole face and made him look like someone different and completely himself at the same time. "Don't," he said, "make this into a headline." And I laughed, and he looked briefly delighted by that, and outside the office windows the city did its indifferent, beautiful thing, and I thought about the distance between here and everywhere, and how that distance had turned out, improbably and somewhat messily, to be shorter than I'd imagined. The parking space between our cars in the Halcyon garage is disputed to this day. We have agreed to disagree. He is wrong. I am right. Some things, even with complete honesty, remain unresolved. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.